Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. and our continuing study of 1968. In some of our previous lectures, we've talked about some of the important events early in the year 1968, including the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War and the fallout after that, and the assassination of Martin Luther King in April. Starting with this lecture and continuing over the next several, we'll start to talk about student protest in 1968, which was an important source of the fuel, of the energy, and in some ways the chaos and the dynamic nature of the year 1968 all over the world. In this first lecture, we'll start by talking about the protests at Columbia University in New York in the spring of 1968. Before we get to that specific event, though, I want to talk for just a little bit in this lecture about students as protesters in general. Students were at the heart of the protests almost everywhere in the world in 1968. This was particularly shocking to many observers because students had long been a part of the power structure rather than those opposed to it and challenging it. So this was a new development. With the baby boom generation, there were more teenagers in the global population than there ever had been before. And just keep in mind that these are children who are coming of age. They were born in 1946, 47, 48, 49. And so now in 1968, they are 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. And this generation in general swelled all around the world. So there were more teenagers participating. Their parents, again, all around the world, had survived the Great Depression and World War II. So they had known hardship and suffering and sacrifice and deprivation. These teenagers, the baby boom generation on the other hand, really hadn't known that kind of hardship. They didn't understand what their parents had gone through, and they didn't necessarily feel the need to play it safe in the way that their parents did. They were far more willing to be adventurous and take risks than their parents' generation. And so some sort of rebelling against one's parents is normal. Every generation, in some ways, outgrows and turns against what their parents are saying. But this was particularly profound with this generation in the late 1960s. They're also beginning to feel a growing sense of identity and empowerment. This group was becoming an important part of the global marketplace. And so advertising and marketers and the media are starting to pay more attention to them and turn to them. And in turn, the students themselves began to feel more entitled and empowered in the midst of that. We will talk about many of the different protests happening around the world individually. And as we will see, each group of students and others involved in the protests each had their own experiences and their own motivations and goals. Every episode is unique in its own ways. But saying that, this sort of global movement among the students did share some common goals that we see in virtually every case around the world, and in some cases in all of them around the world. So there's a common theme of attempting to expand democracy by expanding people's control over their own lives. So there's a theme here of what we might call freedom, but certainly democracy, representation, and obviously in some countries, that movement is repressed more than in others, but it's a common theme all around the world. There's also the common notion of an organization without leaders, that active participation by everyone was the most important criteria. And we'll see, and again, we'll talk more about this as the lectures go on, but this can be a good thing or a bad thing. An organization without leaders, it does feel very democratic. Everyone feels a sense of participation. Everyone feels involved. On the other hand, it can be hard to move a crowd of thousands of protesters in one common purpose if there really isn't any leadership there. And so in some ways, this idea of organization without leaders really never comes to fruition. You can't really have an organization without leaders, but some of them are more leaderless than others, and as we'll see in some cases, that can create problems within the organization itself. This generation is also more willing to turn away from traditional parties and politics. They are looking for a new political space. And again, in many cases, they are rejecting or at least reframing what their parents and the older generation was working with. Most of the student groups around the world, not always, but most of them at least attempt to connect with the working masses. And this is one of the themes we're going to talk a lot about because it has important consequences for many of the movements. How successful are they in actually connecting with the workers? We'll see in some cases there's actually a natural sort of animosity between the working masses and the student leaders, the workers. We're talking about rank and file workers. Oftentimes look at the students as kind of privileged and entitled and not identifying and understanding with the issues that they're dealing with. And so the sense in some cases is just go back to class, go back to school. What are you doing out here in the streets disrupting things? In other cases, they do achieve some kind of connection with the workers. And those are the instances where we see some of the movements that really swell to incorporate a lot of the population and not just student leaders. So they are attempting to connect with workers, with farmers, with the peasantry, and others. As one veteran of the movement said, I began to realize what it was all about. The state had mobilized. It taught me two lessons. Students by themselves were never going to get anywhere. Secondly, that the contribution of student activism, intelligence, humor, and organizational ability had to go into the workers' movement in some way. Students in general can provide an ideal source of protesters. They have some natural advantages. They're generally not of the lowest financial class, so they have the means and wherewithal to support a movement. They are educated and literate, and more politically aware at times than other groups. They're also young and energetic and looking for outlets to vent their energy. Most are at an age when they're seeking to assert independence and their own identity, often by breaking with societal norms or family traditions, or as I've mentioned, just rebelling in some ways against their parents. They have less to lose than other groups, as students are not as often tied down by commitments to home, family, and career. And finally, and not insignificantly, students have more time to dedicate to such activities. Most even relish the opportunity to skip class for something as exciting as a protest march. So, compared to average workers or people involved in a career or university professors or those involved in the government power structure itself, students have a lot of natural advantages that allow them to become, in many ways, the heartbeat of the protest in 1968. At the same time, students do have some flaws as protesters that, as we will see, seep into many of the different movements around the world and lead to some cracks and weaknesses within some of the movements. So while they do have the advantages I just mentioned, students also at times suffer from apathy, laziness, and spottiness of commitment. So I mentioned that they tend to have time, but many of them often don't necessarily want to focus their time on something like a protest. For many of them, their political awareness and interest is only just developing, and many may not identify with the ideals of a broader movement. So what we see in many of these movements is that while there is a focused and driven group of students providing leadership, so a small kind of core who are committed to it, the masses of students may or may not follow them, and they might not remain as interested over the duration of a prolonged protest. So many of the things we're going to talk about in this course play out over weeks and months, and in some cases even years. And so there tends to be a small group of students who are deeply involved throughout the whole thing, and then Other times, many of the students kind of get tired of it or don't stay with it as much. Students, again, they're young, they're energetic, they tend to be drawn in by the excitement and the charge of the movement. With many of these events, word is getting out. Something is going on at the quad or something is going on in the streets. And so students are drawn in. But when it kind of settles into a day-to-day grind, these movements, there is a day-to-day sort of operation involved. Printing out flyers, handing out flyers, knocking on doors, going out to the streets, day after day after day. And when that part of the movement settles in, many of the students kind of quietly make their way back to the classroom. And we start to see them losing interest in the day-to-day operations of running a movement. So, we will talk about all of these different factors as we look at the different movements all over the world. But in this first lecture, as I move on to the next lecture, we'll be focusing on the movement at Columbia University in the spring of 1968, and we'll see many of these factors at play there.